Telemetry dropped for Phobos 2 while it was still doing its job. On a Soviet mission console in March 1989. The signal did not explode or vanish cleanly. It fractured. One moment, Mars orbit data streamed in steady and precise. The next, the carrier wave bent, slipped, and came back distorted. Then silence between bursts. Engineers at Mission Control in Moscow watched a live feed that looked like a heartbeat failing under compression. A black and white frame arrived late from orbit around Phobos. The moon filled half the image, but it was smeared, stretched, rotating too fast to interpret. Then another frame. Worse. The visual anchor begins here, a potato-shaped world dragged into a spinning blur before the signal cuts again. The official assumption was simple. A communication fault, a pointing error, something in the antenna alignment. But within minutes, that explanation started collapsing under its own weight. The spacecraft was still executing commands, still responding in fragments. And that is what made it worse, because a dead probe does not respond at all. At Mission Control, Soviet engineers pushed a routine recovery sequence. They sent stabilization commands. They expected attitude correction. Instead, the telemetry gap widened. Each correction attempt arrived delayed, misaligned, almost as if the spacecraft was no longer oriented in the same reality as Earth. Then a second image arrived. The visual anchor returns, Phobos again. But now the frame is tilted at an impossible angle, as if the camera itself is tumbling through orbit. The signal does not just weaken, it forgets how to agree with itself. The pressure point was not distance, it was dependency. Hidden inside Phobos 2 was a routine battery diagnostic. A harmless maintenance sequence designed to confirm power stability during orbital operations. But that test did not sit alone. It quietly shared logic with the attitude control system. One decision tree feeding another. One assumption about power state quietly rewriting how the spacecraft decided what direction was up. At first, nothing looked wrong. Battery telemetry improved. Voltage readings stabilized. Engineers logged it as routine. The spacecraft even entered its observation window for Phobos imaging. That should have been the safest phase. Instead, the system began to drift. Not physically at first, logically. A third image arrived from orbit. The visual anchor again. Phobos is still visible, but now the frame rotates in slow motion, like the camera is searching for a stable horizon and failing. The data packet that follows is incomplete, not missing, corrupted in structure, as if the spacecraft is still working, but working without a consistent reference point. On Earth, analysts began to see the hidden dependency unfold. The battery test had temporarily altered the spacecraft's internal power mode. That change fed into attitude logic. Attitude logic fed back into antenna pointing. Antenna pointing controlled communication, so a power check had quietly become a navigation decision. No single failure, a chain of correct behaviors producing the wrong outcome. For a brief window, they believed they could recover it. If they could reset attitude control, they could restore comms. If they restored comms, they could reassert commands. Mission Control issued a sequence designed to force safe pointing mode. The spacecraft responded, partially, then inconsistently. And this is where the system stopped behaving like a machine and started behaving like a trapped loop. A fourth image arrives. The visual anchor returns again. Phobos is now barely recognizable. A dark smear dragging across static. The camera exposure spikes, then drops, as if the spacecraft cannot decide how to see. The transmission cuts mid-frame. Comes back, cuts again. Each return weaker than the last. What changed was not power, not hardware failure. It was authority. The spacecraft no longer had a single governing state. The battery system believed it was in diagnostic mode. The attitude system believed it was correcting orientation. The communication system believed it was pointed at Earth. All three were true locally. None were true globally. And so Phobos 2 began to spin itself out of coordination. At Mission Control, the dependency became undeniable. Every recovery command assumed stable orientation. Every stable orientation depended on power logic. Every power logic cycle was still influenced by the battery test that had already completed. But completion did not mean disengagement. The system had not exited the test cleanly. It had never fully returned. Then came the midpoint realization that changed everything. This was no longer a probe losing contact. This was a probe continuing to operate without shared reality between its subsystems. The signal did not fail all at once. It degraded in a contradiction. Data packets arrived with correct internal structure but wrong spatial meaning. Imaging sequences still ran, but they pointed into the wrong orientation. Engineering teams realized something uncomfortable. The spacecraft might still be functional, just no longer reachable in any consistent way. Another image arrived. The visual anchor again. This time, Phobos appears stable for half a second before the frame tears sideways. The moon splits across the screen as if reality itself has misaligned. Then silence for a longer interval than before. Pressure escalated in Moscow. Ground stations attempted brute force reinitialization, power cycling commands, safe mode triggers. But each command assumed a unified system, and there was no longer unity. The battery subsystem, the attitude subsystem, and the comms subsystem were operating like three separate spacecraft sharing one body. Then the final window opened. A last sequence of images arrived. The visual anchor returns for the final time. Phobos is visible, but only as a fragmented silhouette. Rotation is no longer smooth. It is broken into jerks, like the camera is being dragged through discontinuous motion. The signal stabilizes for just enough time to confirm one thing. The spacecraft is still alive, still executing, still turning. Then the transmission stops entirely. No explosion. No decay. No final telemetry packet. Just absence. What remained was a probe in orbit around Phobos that could no longer be confirmed as controllable, communicative, or truly lost in the traditional sense. It existed in a state Soviet engineers could not classify. Not dead, not active in any usable way. A ghost produced by a system that kept functioning after losing the conditions that made function meaningful. Years later, the conclusion was not about hardware failure. It was about hidden structure. A routine battery test had quietly redefined the spacecraft's control hierarchy. And once that dependency formed, every correct system behavior reinforced the wrong global state. The last lesson was simple and severe. A spacecraft does not need to fail to disappear. It only needs to stop sharing a single version of reality. And Phobos 2 never came back into alignment again.